Thank you for joining us today on the At the Table podcast, where I strive to encourage and equip you on your journey to know and follow Jesus Christ. This week on the At the Table podcast, we're going to look back at last week's message. We're going to look ahead to this week's message titled Deliverance. And we're also going to look at a difficult question that so many have asked. Why does God allow evil in this world? All right, with no further ado, let's get to this week's episode. Last week, we looked at Joseph, and the title of the message was From Slave to Deputy Pharaoh. But before we get to the slave part, let's tell you a little bit and remember about Joseph. Joseph was one of 12 brothers, but Joseph was also his father's favorite son, and this was very evident in how he treated him, so much so that it caused major frustrations with the other brothers. In fact, the Bible tells us in Genesis 37 that they didn't like him. In fact, it says they hated him. What an awful way to be. Well, but Joseph wasn't just his father's favorite son. Joseph also did some things to maybe make his brothers even more jealous, including telling them a couple of dreams and how one day they would be bowing down to him. This certainly didn't help the problem. Well, through a series of events, Joseph was going to check on his brothers one day as they were shepherds taking care of the flock in the field. And as he was approaching, they conspired together to kill him. So Joseph arrives, and they decide at that moment not to kill him. Instead, they throw him in a cistern, and they sell him to some folks driving by on the way to Egypt. No, I said driving by, but we realized that they were riding, most definitely, and walking, of course. Well, this group of people, interestingly enough, is called the Ishmaelites, which, if we trace their lineage back, we realize that they descended from Ishmael, who was in fact a son of Abraham through the maidservant Hagar. But that's a different story. If you want to hear more about that, go back and listen to the previous week's message. So Joseph is sent into Egypt, and he ends up being sold to a man by the name of Potiphar. Potiphar was the captain of the guard. I would imagine a very well-to-do man who had a lot of things to take care of. Well, in the midst of serving Potiphar, it was clear to Potiphar that God was with him. And because of this, he put Joseph in charge of all of his household. Well, this sounded good, but it ended up leading to another sidestep, if you will. Potiphar's wife then had attractions to Joseph and tried to get him to commit a sin that was against God and against Potiphar, but Joseph wouldn't do that. This ended up landing Joseph in jail. In the midst of being in jail, Joseph ran into two guys who were also thrown into jail, the chief cupbearer as well as the chief baker for the Pharaoh. While in prison, these men had dreams that led to two very different results. Joseph was able to translate their dreams because God was giving him the answers. And so it turns out that both of these dreams came true, just as Joseph had said. Joseph, in the midst of this, had told the cupbearer to not forget him when he was returned to service for the Pharaoh. But, of course, in the midst of everything that happened, the cupbearer forgot. 2 years later, in fact, the Pharaoh had a couple of dreams himself. And in the midst of this, the cupbearer then remembered Joseph. Joseph was brought to the court and, in fact, was able to tell the Pharaoh what the two dreams were meant. They actually were two dreams, but about the same thing that was going to happen. The two dreams pointed to 7 years of prosperity, which would be followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph recommended that during the 7 years of prosperity that they would in fact set grain aside so that there would be food enough to get the people through the 7 years of famine. Well, lo and behold, these things actually came to happen. And because of Joseph's dream and good thinking provided by the Lord, he was put in charge of everything, not only in Potiphar's house, but in Egypt. He was put second in charge. And in fact, everybody answered to him, and he was the one that basically ran the kingdom. Well, the famine came, and this famine wasn't just in Egypt, but was widespread to the region around, even to Joseph's family where they lived in Canaan. So Joseph's family went to get food. Well, they didn't realize, though, when they went to get food, they would run into Joseph. Through a series of visits and a couple of crafty things put into place by Joseph, Joseph's true identity was revealed to his brothers. Now, they were certainly worried because they knew that they had sold him into slavery. But Joseph had long since forgiven them and realized that God's plan for restoration that worked through the family of Joseph and in Joseph specifically was to bring about restoration to God's people. And part of this was to put him in place at Egypt. So in Genesis chapter 50, where we see that Joseph tells his brothers, "You intended this for harm, but God intended this for good, into saving of many people." And that concludes our wrap up of last week's message. If you'd like to hear more detail, you can look and watch the sermon on our YouTube channel, or you can subscribe to the GCC Sermons podcast and listen to it on any mobile device. Well, this week, instead of taking a break in between the what happened last week and what happened next week, I'm going to dive right in and take a look at where we're going next week. This week in the sermon, we're going to actually break up the message into three parts. Now, it is a fifth Sunday, and we've got a lot going on, and we also have our kids in the service, so that's part of the reason. But here's kind of the gist of where we're going to go. In the first section, we're going to talk about how God is setting the stage for deliverance. See, God brought his people to Egypt and then allowed them to enter into slavery, but that wasn't the end of the story. He was setting the stage for deliverance. Then in the second message, we're going to look at how God reveals his power to the Pharaoh. See, the Pharaoh that had put Joseph in charge has long since passed away, and there is a new Pharaoh in town. And he wasn't treating the Israelites well, so God had to send a message and show his power. And then finally, in the third message, God delivers his people. So in the first message, really briefly, God's setting the stage for deliverance. We're going to look at how this nation of Israel was in bondage and in slavery. And then God began to craft his plan and set the stage by choosing a man, Moses, and he set him apart from when he was a little baby to an older man, and he is setting his stage for deliverance. Now, God is going to reveal himself to Moses, and then finally, God is going to start to answer the cry of the Israelite people for deliverance. Well, in the second message, God is going to reveal his power, and he primarily is going to do this through a series of plagues that are going to come into Egypt. Now, in this section of his revealing of his power, we're going to look at the first 9 plagues. Everything from turning the water of the Nile to blood, to frogs, to gnats, to flies, to livestock dying, to painful boils, to hail, to locusts, and finally to 3 days of darkness. God's power is on full display. And finally, in the third message, we're going to see how God delivers his people. He sends one more plague that will bring Pharaoh and all of the Egyptians to their knees. And then we see how this exodus, the mass exodus of nearly 2 million people, begins to happen as they leave Egypt. And God's display of his power is not yet done as he takes them across and through a big sea and parts the waters and leads them across. And even later down the road, he feeds them miraculously in the desert. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, and that is how God is going to work. That is how God has worked, and that is how we're going to look at this. Again, God sets the stage for deliverance, God reveals his power, and God delivers his people. Well, that is the recap of last week's message with Joseph and what God does through him, and that is a look ahead at what we're going to look at this Sunday, called deliverance. But I wanted to jump back to last week's message and just kind of tell you a little bit about what God's been showing me in my life. One of the discussion questions is from the book, The Story About Last Week's Message is this. It says, why does God allow hurtful things to happen to people? Well, it got me thinking because I get this question a lot. In fact, I see this question a lot on Facebook and across various social medias and even in interacting with other people, especially non-Christians. It's really hard sometimes to wrap our mind around why God allows suffering. And, even within our church right now, we've got so many folks that are dealing with debilitating diseases and cancer and just hard times, financial times, the loss of loved ones, the difficulty understanding why this is happening to me. And this really is a difficult question. And I was thinking to a book that I'd read recently by Dr. Michael Rydelnik. If you don't know who he is the host of Open Line Radio for Moody Radio. He also is a dean at the College of Moody, the Bible Institute, as well as a professor there of Jewish studies. And he has this innate ability to answer questions on the fly. And it's really a cool radio show to listen to. So he's on the radio on Saturday mornings on Moody Radio. And you can also check out some of the things he does. But he tackled this question in his book, the most important, Bible questions. And the question that was posed to him time and time again is, why does God allow so much evil and suffering? And spoiler alert, the short answer really is that we don't know. We don't fully understand. But there are some principles that we can pull from God's word to help us get through difficult times. And here's one of them. One of them is that God is sovereign. Quoting from his book on page 325, we see this. It says, first, when considering life's challenges, we must recognize the absolute truth that God is sovereign over everything, including suffering. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, this is what God's word says. It says, I form light and create darkness. I make success and create disaster. I am the Lord who does all these things. Just as God is sovereign creator, he is a sovereign over disasters. And so I just wanted to leave a bit of encouragement with you today, that in the midst of life, when things don't go the way we want, when we don't understand, when we don't even begin to believe that how this could possibly be happening to us, I want to leave you this encouragement. God is in control. Just like we saw in last week's message with Joseph, and how God used even sinful, hurtful decisions by people to put people in harm's way, like selling Joseph to slavery. God was able to use that situation, and his purposes came to be. God is a trustworthy God. You can place your trust in him. See, even in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of bad things happening, we can rest in the fact that God is sovereign. The second aspect to why does evil exist and why does God allow this to happen, and how can we wrap our mind around this, is the second thing is we realize that we have human limitations. God's ways are above our ways. God's decisions and understanding are so far in front of where we're at and what we can possibly wrap our mind around. It's we can place our trust in him, knowing he is sovereign, and because we are limited, we are able to trust him. We're able to place our trust in him. He is a promise-keeping God that has in fact always been right. You can read the whole Old Testament, and every prophecy that ever happened about what was to come came true 100%. Culminating in the sending of his son, Jesus. And because of this, we can trust what his word says, and his promises are true. And another important thing to remember when we're dealing with suffering in this world and bad things happening is that, in fact, we do live in a fallen world. We're reminded in Genesis chapter 3, something we looked at a couple weeks ago, that when sin entered the world, it boogered everything up. It caused everything to be harder, and it caused these things to enter into existence. And even in the midst of this brokenness, God is able to work. It's because of these factors and because of who God is that I can take the next step when bad things happen. It allows me to go into that next room when I know somebody I'm visiting is struggling and suffering with some debilitating disease. It's what enables me as the pastor to be able to take that step and to follow God and what he is calling. And it's because I realize that he is sovereign, that this world is broken, that I can't fully understand, that I'm able to read a verse like Romans 8:28 and realize that, yes, I can follow God. Romans 8:28 says this, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. You know, the context of this is a little bit early in chapter 8. Paul says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory of God. In other words, he realizes that what we're going through now, what trials we encounter in this world, are not worth comparing to God. See, he recognizes that there are troubles. He realizes this, but he realizes that in the sovereignty of God, that's why he's able to say, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. It does not say that all things will work out well. It just means that in the end, God's going to use everything that's happening, the good, the bad, the ugly, and everything in between, to work out the end for us. But we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. And what's the good? The good is that we know someday this life is temporary and we're going to be with Jesus forever if you in fact love him and have been called by him. So today, I hope this encourages you. It may not take away the pain. It may not take away the suffering. It may not take away what's going on. But see, even in the midst of what's going on, God is at work. He's going to use this present situation for your good, to bring others to know you, to give you an opportunity and a platform to share your faith. Maybe, just maybe, you're going through what you're going through to bring someone to salvation and knowing God as their personal Savior. And wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, that's enough for today, and I realize I've gone a little longer than I normally go, but that's okay. Hey, I'm the podcast creator. I'm allowed to do what I want. I hope that this message of looking back and looking ahead, as well as looking a little bit into why God allows suffering, brings you encouragement and equips you to better follow Jesus Christ today. Have a great day, and I hope to see you on Sunday.
You have been listening to the At the Table podcast with Pastor Gary. I hope this episode has left you encouraged and equipped. Pastor Gary is the lead pastor of Grace Community Church in Alliance, Ohio. To learn more about the church, the ministries at the church, or to give to support Grace Community Church, you can follow the links in the show notes or go directly to gccofalliance.org. Have a blessed day.